Well, welcome one and all. I'm Tom Bedell, happy to be with you at our 20th Brattleboro Literary Festival. We would have preferred to be doing this live rather than virtually, but such is life these days. We're very pleased to have with us today Jonathan Alter, former Newsweek senior editor and surely no stranger to anyone who's ever switched on MSNBC or NBC for some of his keen political analysis, seen some of his television productions, or perused his newsletter, Old Goats, Ruminating with Friends, or read his previous best-selling books on US Presidents Obama and FDR. Well, he's done it again with the completely enthralling, his very best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. So I feel compelled now that it might be time to confess that along with too many Americans in 1980, I didn't vote a second time for Jimmy Carter. I hasten to add I didn't vote for Ronald Reagan either, but my wife and I voted separately that day for some reason, not knowing how the other was leaning. And when we returned home, found out we both voted for Barry Commoner.
Wow.
Remember him?
Oh yeah.
So there's a crumb of solace that we helped our 39th president begin what many think of as one of the most successful post presidencies in history, and also freeing him up to become one of the most prolific presidential authors we've ever had. So it's all in Jonathan's terrific book. We're also fortunate to have Megan Mayhew Bergman here to act as a moderator for this session. Megan is the author of the story collections Birds of a Lesser Paradise, Almost Famous Women, and the forthcoming How Strange a Season. She's a regular columnist for Audubon and The Guardian, where she's also written about President Carter. Megan teaches at Middlebury College here in Vermont and directs the Breadloaf Environmental Writers Conference. I would just say to viewers that you should see a Q&A toggle on your screen where we urge you to pose some questions that we hope Jonathan will have time to answer toward the end of the session. And you can also upvote others' questions that you see with the thumbs up icon in case we only have time for a few. So with that, Megan, over to you and Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you to Sandy and everyone at the Brattleboro Literary Festival for hosting us and making space for this conversation. For those of you that don't have this actual object, it's heavy and wonderful and has kept me busy for the last 2 months, I'll say. And it's been great company. And Jonathan, you must be used to people sort of orienting themselves in the Carter landscape as they, talk to you about this book. And my version of that is being born in South Carolina in December 1979. And
Oh wow.
right, yeah, and growing up with a very poor public narrative about Carter. And so I felt like this book, while it wasn't written for me, it was written for me. It was one of those really informative pieces. I think when I began studying more about the environment, I sort of realized that my sense of Carter was misinformed. But this book really helped me reconstruct that in such a substantive way. Um, I was wondering if you would at first talk about this incredibly bold cover. I'm sure you've gotten this question before, but I thought it was such a bold and wonderful choice. But I'm sure there was some thought that went into it. So would you mind just talking about the cover selection?
Yes, I'd be happy to. First of all, thank you to the Brattleboro Festival for having me. I wish I was in Vermont. I love Vermont, and normally would love to be up there with you in person. And I'm really glad you asked that question, Megan, because when you were saying that you were born in 1979 and that you grew up when Carter was kind of in bad odor, which lasted for quite a period of time, actually. There's a direct connection between that and why I wanted this Andy Warhol image of him on the cover. So, uh, he was seen as such a almost like a dork or something. He was really belittled through much of his presidency, and people tended to remember the either strange or just sort of uh, nerdy qualities that he had, or little incidents. He was attacked by a rabbit when he was in a canoe on a pond in Georgia. He collapsed in a running race. It wasn't quite a marathon, but a long cross country race, and was wearing black socks and short shorts. And people, just everybody, people my age. I was then just graduating from college, and I thought he was so uncool and unliberal that I actually worked for Ted Kennedy as a volunteer in the 1980 campaign when Kennedy challenged Carter for the nomination. And I had been an intern in the Carter White House. So that was, I really, moved a real distance from him. And looking back on it now, I just think that was just so stupid. It was stupid of the Democratic Party to challenge a decent sitting president. It would be like if, to put it in today's terms, it would be like if Joe Biden, doesn't get as much as people hope in the stimulus in the Build Back Better program, and then there are other things he can't get through. He's unable to get through, and he is running for reelection, and Democrats say, "Nope, we want Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or whatever to challenge Joe Biden for the nomination." That's what the Kennedy challenge was like, and I'm almost ashamed that I was part of it. So when I started to do this book, and when I realized that Carter was arguably the greatest environmental president in our history, and we can talk about him in comparison to Teddy Roosevelt if you want, and had brought peace between Israel and Egypt after 4 wars between them, and prevented a major war in Central America, and basically by raising high the banner of human rights, he had uh, helped to move the world to a much more democratic place, which we're now retreating from a little bit, but there are far more democracies in the world now than there used to be, and Jimmy Carter deserves part of the credit for that. Normalizing relations with China, which is the foundation of the global economy. And the list goes on and on. I haven't even talked about the domestic ones. We can get to that. But what I wanted to do with the cover was to remind people who were around then, and to say to a younger generation, there was a time when Jimmy Carter was cool in 1976 when he was elected president. And this was a period of recovery from Watergate, and he was seen as being a breath of fresh air and a truth teller, and somebody who Warhol was anxious to commemorate. So I told my publisher that I wanted that on the cover, and I wasn't sure they were going to do it because the Warhol estate is famously greedy, and but Simon and Schuster, to their great credit, paid whatever the licensing fee was, and they never told me, but I know it was a considerable amount of money that they paid to get that image.
It's wonderful. I remember coming across the anecdote in your book about Carter drinking bourbon with Bob Dylan and the Allman Brothers in the
Uh,
governor's mansion. And again, that wasn't something that I could fit into my narrative about who he was, that there could be this complexity, which I think you honor so well in the book, of someone who's so righteous and moralistic and also, has capacity. Um, I think that there's much to talk about, obviously, but I want to take it back to, for you to say a little bit more about your engagement with this material. And I think I was reading recently about an Alice Neal exhibit, and she called herself a thief of souls. And I think the same was said about portraitist Romaine Brooks. And it's sort of, I started to see the connective tissue between, a portraitist and a biographer, and just what what is it in you that feels drawn to this material, to biography? Could you speak to that?
that's a really uh, good and difficult question. Normally, I think biographers are drawn to their subjects when they see something of themselves uh, in the person that they're writing about. And, you know, other than his sense of decency and honesty, and seriousness of purpose, which I like to think in my more sort of self-regarding moments. I like to think that I have. Other than that, I have so little in common with this man. I mean, I was terrible at math and science, and he is he was a nuclear engineer, and he um, is an enormously able person at all of the things that he can do, and I list them early in the book. He's a true Renaissance man, and I can't do any of them, and I can't really relate to my life to his ability. It came into sharp relief in Memphis in 2016 when I joined Jimmy and Rosalind Carter on a Habitat for Humanity work site, and we built. I helped them and others build a house. To say that I helped is, I tried to help. At one point, President Carter came over and he instructed me on how to hammer because he noticed that I really wasn't very good at that. And he, even in his 90s, could drive a nail into a plank, with just 3 or 4 strokes. And I was actually pleased to learn that he also instructed Bill Clinton, with whom he has not gotten along at all, although he showed up. The Clintons showed up in July to the Carter's 75th wedding anniversary, which Emily, my wife, and I were both there, and so it was a sign of sort of the end of their long, fraught feud, that the Clintons came. But to get back to your question, I'm wandering away from it. I My path to this book started when Carter came to a book group that I'm in New York City. I live just outside New York, and he was talking about Camp David. We had been reading a book by Lawrence Wright about Camp David, and I realized after that evening there has to be more to this man than failed president, great former president, which it, anybody you talk to out on the street, they'll say, oh, Jimmy Carter, yeah, bad president, really good former president. When I learned about Camp David, it was such a virtuoso performance. Both Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin threatened to leave many times during the conference, and Carter, was just his doggedness and his knowledge of the details, which he was frequently criticized for, that led this to happen. So I thought there's got to be more to him than this. And then when I started talking to my editor, the late great Alice Mayhew at Simon & Schuster, who was one of the great nonfiction editors of the century, Bob Woodward, David McCullough, a lot of other, Doris Kearns Goodwin. She is all of their editor, and this was my 4th book with her. And she said, "Well, I'm Jimmy Carter's editor, and I can help smooth the way." And she did, and so I just knew Carter slightly before that. I had interviewed him when I was at Newsweek, but I didn't really know him, and she managed to get me a tremendous amount of access. So biographers have to have, of living subjects, and it's easier, honestly, when they're no longer living. But for living subjects, you really have to have the access to make it worthwhile. And I was able to do that and spend quite a bit of time with everybody in the Carter family.
I was reading your acknowledgments and thinking about the level of access that you had. I think you spoke to 18 different family members, and there was also material that became either declassified or available to you that other people hadn't had access to. Is that right? Can you talk about just what?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. On the former point, I talked to both President and Mrs. Carter on several occasions at their home, at their office, at the Carter Center, as I mentioned, on a Habitat site. I went with them to Annapolis for the 70th anniversary of his graduation, and that was also the year of their 70th wedding anniversary. And then I did the first interview with Amy Carter, who had been, she had been she 10-year-old when they got to the White House, and so wasn't giving interviews at that time. And even when she was an anti-apartheid activist, really was very shy and didn't want to give interviews. But her parents prevailed upon her to talk to me, so I found out some interesting things from her. And her brothers, Jack, Jeff, and Chip, were all extremely helpful, and their spouses and ex-spouses, plus other relatives. Um, so that helped fill out the picture. But equally important for me in terms of interviews were the interviews I was able to do with people who knew him before he was president. To my mind, in some ways, the most compelling part of my research was about this man in the Jim Crow South who knows the right thing to do. He's been raised, his father's a white supremacist, his mother is a nurse who takes care of black patients for free, and he has a third parent, an illiterate uh, black woman sharecropper, effectively a parent who teaches him his love for nature and God. But when he comes back from the Navy in 1953, when his father dies, he's in this very intense uh, environment of white terrorism. That's really the only words that you can use to describe it. So it was very important for me to make contact with at least some people who knew him in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s when he was governor. And so those interviews are, in some ways, some of my most memorable ones. In terms of the declassified documents, there were a number of CIA documents that were declassified that helped me fill out what was going on during the Iran hostage crisis, and also the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. And so, in reading, say, minutes from National Security Council meetings where they're discussing, should we boycott the Olympics? Should we have a grain embargo? Both of which turned out to be very unpopular ideas. How should we respond? I was getting, a really up close look at the way he was governing. A number of the other documents had been declassified earlier, but I was lucky to get some new ones. And then my big revelation the big thing I have that has never been published before are Jimmy Carter's love letters to Rosalind from the Navy, which are quite steamy. And I took a look at like Abigail and John Adams' correspondence, and I was I was under the impression that these were the steamiest letters ever exchanged between a future president and first lady, until somebody reminded me fairly recently that Woodrow Wilson's letters to Edith when he was courting her, but they were not as steamy. They were good, but they were not quite as steamy. So anyway, that was a new thing, and it took quite a while to build enough trust with Rosalind Carter for her to show those to me, and they knew that it was going to be warts and all, and to their credit, they were not expecting me to write a hagiographic depiction of them, and I did not. Although her reaction afterwards was, well, Jonathan had some very critical things to say about Jimmy, but he only said nice things about me, and that is basically true because I just think she's such a formidable woman of much unheralded accomplishment. I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago on Old Goats about how she and Betty Bumpers, the wife of Senator Dale Bumpers, they went around the country in 1977, and with the help of the CDC and her husband's budget, they were able to convince at that time, I think they had to convince like 28 state legislatures to pass requirements requiring vaccinations before children could go to school. So, to me, one of the really nutty things about what's going on now is all these governors are opposed to COVID vaccinations when they have vaccinations for measles, mumps, rubella, polio, and you can't go to school. You can't send your kid to school without them. In some states, including New York, that includes private schools as a matter of public health. So all of this started with Rosalind Carter, and that's just one of many of her contributions.
I also noticed, I think you had access to her personal diary, and I found that really humanizing when you were talking about the negotiations at Camp David. Um,
Yeah,
and I was,
that really helped a lot because um,
yeah,
so yeah, I should have mentioned. I'm glad you brought that up because there have been many accounts of Camp David, but mine is, I think it's fair to say it's humanized because I was able to get Rosalind's diaries. So she did not, she just kept diaries unpublished at particular periods of stress, like around the time when they failed around hostage rescue mission and a couple of happier times, but mostly when she thought something very historic was going on. Jimmy Carter kept diaries throughout, which he would dictate at the end of the day throughout his presidency, um, and they've been published, but uh, undigested. And I worried at first that there were things that were not published that I would want to see, and that maybe he, you know, made sure were not in the published versions of his diaries. But every time I asked him to let me see his diaries on a day when he hadn't recorded anything, when I thought something significant happened, he did. So I actually don't think that he was uh, kind of prettying up his diaries. He did, however, in books, sugarcoat some of the realities of the way he responded to segregation and white terrorism in the South. And he was ducking the civil rights movement for several years because he was worried about his business with good reason. His warehouse business being boycotted, and he was politically ambitious. And when I pressed him on it at one point, he said, "Well, I had a choice. I could be governor of Georgia, or I could denounce segregation." And he chose to be governor of Georgia. And then he started denouncing segregation within literally seconds of being sworn in his inaugural address as governor. So this is a very complicated guy. He's not a saint. He can be very cold at times, but the complexity fascinated me. And just in answer to your initial question about biography, you have to live with these people in your head for a long time, in my case for 5 years. And so you want them to be good company. And the way they're good company is when they're complicated and also decent and ultimately have some nobility to them. So in that sense, I was, just to tell you a quick story. I was in the Carter Library doing research, and I got texted by MSNBC, and they said, you need to get to a studio in Atlanta. Donald Trump is going to announce his campaign today. So I went over there and I covered, him descending the escalator, and I don't really remember much of what I said, although that day on TV, although I did say that I thought he was dangerous. I think I also said stupidly that I didn't think he'd ever get elected president. Um, what I mostly remember was going back to the library and having this kind of sense of cleansing. It was almost like as I'm turning the pages of this honest man's story, it's almost like washing away the toxins of Trump. So every time I would get frustrated by Trump and Trump living rent free in my head, I would go back to Jimmy Carter, and that's my hope for readers too, is that it's almost an inspiration that our politics can be better than they are right now.
I absolutely experienced it that way. I was folding laundry with my partner today, just talking about how the sheer amount of things that Carter accomplished as both a human, in public and private life, the work ethic, the decency, I do find it staggering. I find it hard to even encapsulate in conversation, which is why I appreciated how much you included there, but also the way you treated complexity. And I'm working on my first nonfiction book, and someone told me, "Don't fall in love with your subjects," and I think about that a lot. Could you talk just technically how you balance sort of fact and insight, when you're writing? Because I felt like you did this particularly beautifully with the 40s, when you're reporting his life, in service, and how he's, starting his family. There are a lot of facts, but then there's also emotional truth and then insight, I think, that's required to help us see how this has a dotted line to later parts of his personality. H- did you have to work at that? I mean, how do you think about that? It's a selfish
Yeah.
question for
Well,
me.
the answer, do you have to work at that? The answer is yes. I think that the expression "writing is rewriting" is very accurate. You have to go back at it over and over. But everybody has their different has a slightly different approach. So in my case, I'm always, and this comes from my background in journalism, and particularly in news magazine journalism, where if you remember the old time in Newsweek before the internet, these articles, the space was so precious that we had to cram a lot of facts into, often maybe less than a page in the magazine. And so we got skillful over time in cramming a lot of facts in without making it seem like you're cramming a lot of facts in,
Mm.
so it doesn't read like a Wikipedia entry. And but it does train you. You can't waste any sentence. You have to. And as any novelist knows, specificity is what pays off. So I would leave the sort of interpretive parts for the beginning and the end of chapters. And then I would try to like tee up, say, in a chapter, we were talking about the 40s. Okay, so when he's at the Naval Academy in the 40s, start out with something more general about the world at war and the time at the Naval Academy, you know, that he's experiencing, where, for instance, they cut uh, the down to 3 years from 4 years because they needed to get these guys out into World War II, where many of them were killed. And Carter was a little younger, so he didn't graduate until after the war was over. But he thought he was going to end up in the war. So in that chapter and really all the others, kind of set the context. So before I talk about the way he and Deng Xiaoping normalized relations, and that transformed, and what the narrative was of that, I tried to explain, paint a larger picture of the importance of it to get people, because people are they're busy. They want to watch Succession on TV or whatever. They've got a lot of competition for their time. So you do have to hook them at the beginning of a chapter by explaining why it's worth their while to keep reading. What is the larger importance of this? Even just the larger importance of understanding the subject of the biography, or if it's other kind of nonfiction, the milieu, whatever you're trying to convey in that chapter. I tend to sort of write a couple of thematic paragraphs, sometimes more, sometimes less, and then I pause, and you see those like stars or asterisks suggesting there's a pause. Some writers don't use that a lot. I use that often, just to say to the reader, I'm pausing here. Then I start up with the narrative. And the narrative is the most important part in any nonfiction. Because if you try to, argument books and analytical books are great, but they they don't attract that many readers because you get the argument pretty quickly and then you don't really have to read the book, or you can read the argument in a magazine article. And so what pulls in the reader is narrative. So I just go back over and over again to narrative, and a lot of narrative is just finding the colorful, illuminating examples and then trying to um, build them in without too much digression to analysis. But then every so often, to contextualize, you do have maybe even just a half a sentence of interpretation. But mostly you're trying to tell a story.
That was a masterclass. Thank you. Potent and useful for
Uh,
me, but I'm sure for other people listening as well.
can
Um,
you tell us, have you disclosed what you're writing about? Because I'm curious.
I wrote a piece for the New Yorker about the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, which was the first racially integrated all girls swing band that traveled through the Jim Crow South.
Oh,
And
great.
so I was particularly drawn to your presentation of the 40s, to the Jim Crow, atmosphere. But I was looking at it technically just because I was curious how you balanced journalistic, the sort of fact giving with narrativizing, in order to, keep the reader engaged, and then insight. And so I was just really marveling at your balance of those
Oh,
things.
that's so nice. I think just one other thing that I think helped me is that I was on track to give my publisher 1,100 pages, and before I turn anything in, we don't want you to write that long of a book. 800, including notes, is all we'll publish basically. So I, had to do really serious cutting, and I decided that I didn't want to cut whole chapters. I'd done that on a couple of other books, and didn't really like that. So instead, what I did is I just compressed more. So if I was telling a story that was, 4 paragraphs, I told it in two instead, and I don't think it suffered for that. Nobody's prose is deathless, and Jefferson said if I had more time, I'd write you a shorter letter. So one thing that you can do for narrative is to write it, at the length that you like, and then go back and, as they say, kill your darlings. Just say, I've got to make this shorter to hold the reader's attention.
I often teach my students at Middlebury about scene criticality. So these moments where a character is really forged. And I mean, you had obviously so many to choose from, but there were moments where I was regularly astounded by both Carter's competency and his risk taking. Um, Also in the military years, I have to say that those years really grabbed me, in terms of the intelligence, which I think is one of those parts of the public narrative around Carter that gets so skewed. You know, and then that scene is so vivid to me where he's almost washed overboard by a large wave, and just these moments where he had to really think about risk and mortality and reason for doing what he was doing. So it's interesting to hear you speak about scene criticality. Were there any anecdotes that just really stood out to you as surprising when you came across them?
Oh, so many. I think one of the ones in that section of the book that really surprised me as I got into it, and my late editor was also very interested in this, um, but it took me down a bit of a blind alley, which might be instructive. Is that um, Carter's uncle, his name was Tom Gordy, and he was in the Navy, and that's how Carter first dreamed of leaving planes, and his ambition when he was a little boy was to go to the Naval Academy. Nobody in his family had gone to college, and he was the only one in his high school class who went to college. Um, but he fastened on this idea because he'd get these postcards from Tom Gordy. By the way, his sister Lillian Gordy was Jimmy's mother, and they are related to Barry Gordy of Motown through their Carter's great-grandfather's, his great-great-grandfather's affair with a slave. In any event, that's an example of something where, because Carter and Gordy didn't know each other, and Berry Gordy didn't know each other, and it was all hush hush. A lot of people have asked me, well, why didn't you have more about that in the book? And the answer was because there was nothing to write, except that they were related, because it was completely unacknowledged, and even now is barely acknowledged. But what there was something to write about is that Tom Gordy was taken prisoner by the Japanese during World War II, and he had this harrowing experience where he was missing in action and declared dead. And so his wife got remarried, and then it turns out he was alive, and he survives, and he comes back at the end of the war, and he still loves his wife, and she still loves him, and she wants to annul her second marriage and get back with Tom Gordy, Jimmy's uncle. And Jimmy's mother and his aunts and his grandmother were, no, you can't do that. And Jimmy thought it was really unfair to his aunt, who had moved to San Francisco, and he makes a point in several books of because he's written all these books, and he kind of comes back to the same stories over and over again. And a lot of times I had to, as I said, strip the sugarcoating off the stories. But in this case, there was no sugarcoating, because he was really angry at his mother over this, and made a point of going and seeing his aunt, and after she had been shunned by the Carter and Gordy families. So so that was an example of something that told me that Carter was, when he believed something, he would dig in on it, and he didn't. To him, it was a matter of principle that this was deeply unfair to his aunt and uncle to prevent them from remarrying. And it spoke to his principle and his relationship with his mother, which is always important in a biography. But what happened to me was I went down the rabbit hole on it. So in my first draft, I've got the whole story about Tom Gordy's imprisonment, and he goes from this prison camp to that prison camp. And I realize, no, just use the fact that he had to eat rats and, 2 or 3 other colorful details, and cram it all into a couple of paragraphs, instead of, I think I had close to a whole chapter on Tom Gordy. And it was not on the main theme of my book. And so you do have to keep the camera on, so to speak, on your major character or characters. And it's very easy in nonfiction to be sort of carried away on digressions that are fascinating and might be fascinating for readers, but are not on point.
As you're speaking, I already know a chunk in my manuscript that falls under this category. um, I'm thinking, just going back to Carter's relationship with his aunt and his decision making, to continue his relationship with her in defiance of his family in some ways. And I can think of so many points throughout the book where that sort of impulse rears its head. And I'm thinking about the way his morality, his moral compass, I guess, dovetails with this really stubborn quality that he has. And that sort of fascinated me, the way that played out in lots of different scenarios. I mean, would you speak to how I felt like by the end of the book, we were left with that, like, righteousness, and how the public narrative is sort of circling it, and what will become of it. Um, I guess my question that I'm getting to is, how do you think the public narrative is going to land? Maybe in the next 10 years around Carter.
Well, I'm hoping that the public narrative is changing, and that I've made at least a small contribution to that, just reassessing him, reappraising him, convincing people that he may be the most misunderstood president in American history. So I think the fact that he has had such a historic post presidency, and that he's lived a long time. Sometimes if you could just outlive everybody, that your reputation, it sort of comes back around. And I really noticed this when we went to Plains in July for this 75th wedding anniversary. It was everything about Jimmy Carter and what he represented kind of distilled. And it was also in really sharp contrast to the Obama party on Martha's Vineyard, his
Mhm.
birthday party, which was full of a bunch of celebrities. And I'm an admirer of Obama. I wrote 2 books about Barack Obama. I met him when he was an Illinois state senator. And so this isn't meant to slime him, but Carter's party was held in Plains High School, and um, it, as I mentioned, the Clintons were there. Nancy Pelosi was there. Garth Brooks and Trisha Yearling were there, and a lot of other well-known people. But when we were separated into classrooms for the beginning portion of the party, where we were given like moon pies and like really southern food with not fancy, to put it mildly. But what was most striking is that in the classroom we were in, which helped make the whole party more intimate when it was broken up into smaller groups. So we had some people from the press, like Sam Donaldson, who had been very hard on Carter but stayed friends with him, and then Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson's daughter Lucy was there. But most memorable were that Mrs. Carter's hairdresser, a young researcher who was interested in what they had done on climate change at a very early point, who had, I don't even think he had written a book yet, but he was researching, and they found him interesting and spent time with him. And I'm trying to think, but other people, ordinary people. So this was a small d Democratic party, and I think that Carter is his humility, and there's no such thing as a humble politician, almost by definition, but his relative humility and his modesty, and the fact that until recently he mowed the lawn at their church, and Mrs. Carter vacuumed in the sanctuary, and these qualities, if you add them to the human rights policy, which has done so much to invigorate small d democratic forces around the world, you realize that on the important things, eventually history will catch up. And history, I've been a journalist for a long time, but our job as historians is quite different from the job of journalists, where we focus on conflict, on what's colorful, on political success or failure. So Carter was a political failure, and that conditioned that appraisal that you're talking about. But he was a substantive and farsighted success, and it's the job of the historian to look at how did this man's time in office and after he left office, how did it change the lives of people. And on that score, I think historians are catching up, and he's never going to be on Mount Rushmore. He failed in many dimensions of his presidency that we can talk about, but he on things that count, he was way ahead. So people know about the solar panels on the roof of the White House that Reagan took down. That's probably the best known example, but that was really mostly symbolic. There were 15 major pieces of environmental legislation, doubled the size of the national park system with the Alaska Lands Bill overnight, stroke of a pen after a long, hard fight. Many, first toxic waste cleanup, first subsidizing of clean energy. and then many things sort of in the sort of cracks that don't get noticed. So I asked a good reporter who was paying attention at that time. I said, "Do you remember Purpa?" And he goes, "No, what was Purpa?" They had a bill signing like once every 2 weeks in the Carter White House. Now I think Trump had, 2 or 3 pieces of legislation in 4 years. And so the press just stopped paying attention to all these bills. This guy says, "So what was PURPA?" I said, "It was the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act." You're almost asleep by the time you hear it, the name of it. But it allowed public utilities to use green energy. you know, it created regulatory structures that incentivized them to do that. And so, this is still an issue in the debate over the Biden bill right now, and Manchin is trying to push back on that. But it wasn't even possible until the Carter administration. And there are just so many things like that in many different areas that I just think it's inevitable that he will be seen in a more favorable light as time goes on.
I love that. Given our time, I probably should let you end on that very poetic moment and turn it over to the the audience just to see
Sorry,
what.
I'm sorry for the long-winded answers.
No, it was wonderful. Let's see. Um, okay, so this is from a listener named Wayne, and he says, "As a Jewish American, I know the anger and upset that Carter's statements and writings about Israel and apartheid have caused many. Can you speak briefly about Carter's views and their evolution, and also how Carter has responded to the criticism?"
Yeah, so I deal with this a lot in the book. I'm Jewish, and I was upset in 2006 when he entitled a book, Palestine, Peace or Apartheid. It's interesting to me that in the years since then, Ehud Barak, a former prime minister of Israel, is just one of many Israeli politicians who have warned of the same thing and used that word apartheid and said if we don't change course, we're going to have an apartheid situation, which is what Carter was arguing. But there's no question that he has been pro-Palestinian in his writing and his speeches in recent years, and he's clearly the most pro-Palestinian president we've ever had. At the same time, I would argue that he did more for the security of the state of Israel than any president since Harry Truman, who presided over the recognition of Israel in 1948. Why do I say that? Well, you have to go to the Camp David Accords. So when I was growing up as a Jewish kid in Chicago, we always heard the danger to Israel posed in the same terms, which is Israel is in danger of being driven into the sea. This small country surrounded by enemies, fighting wars in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973. That's over now. Israel is not in danger of being driven into the sea because there was only one army that had that capacity, and that was the Egyptian army. And so for the past 43 years, there has been peace between Israel and Egypt, and so Israel is not nearly as vulnerable. I just think that's important contextually to understand. Carter himself is not at all anti-Semitic. It's been thrown at him over the years. It's just completely untrue, as many Jewish friends and people in his administration will attest. He did express to me that he was saddened by the fact that after the book, he lost some Jewish friends. But there were just a lot of misconceptions that the Carter Center was supported by Arabs, and that wasn't true. He had some Arab support, but it wasn't any more than, various universities, and it wasn't anywhere close to being a significant part of their budget, as his critics have sometimes alleged. meeting with Hamas, which became an issue in around 2007. Um, Diplomacy is about talking to your enemies and bad guys. It's easy to talk to your friends. And Carter's objective in meeting with Hamas was to bring peace between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, Fatah. Because if you can get one Palestinian body to negotiate with Israel, you're going to be further along in the peace process. So this was in the interest of advancing the peace process that had started at Camp David, but he was unsuccessful in getting a comprehensive Middle East peace at Camp David, and that was really the great regret of his presidency. And he intended to get that accomplished in a second term, among other things. But I guess he's the only Democrat who didn't get a majority of Jewish votes in 1980, and it was understandable because Camp David hadn't yet held. But now that it's held for all this time, I do think that American Jews who have been critical of Carter should look at it anew and appreciate what Camp David accomplished.
Thank you for that. We have one more question, and this is from Tom, who introduced us this afternoon.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You know what? Maybe I could do a quick round and promise I'm going to give one or two sentence answers because I feel bad that some other people had questions weren't able to get.
Oh, that's okay. I think we're doing fine. Tom wants to know who wins the presidential author title, Carter or Teddy Roosevelt?
Great question. I guess it depends on whether you do it by number of titles, in which case it would be Carter, or total verbiage, in which case I think it might be Teddy Roosevelt, because a lot of Carter's books are things like a coffee table book on woodworking, or a short book on fishing, and he tends to write very short. So probably just because of the literary styles of the last turn of the century, it would probably be Theodore Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson's up there too. He was an academic and he wrote several academic tomes.
Do you think Obama will join the ranks? I know that he's, always had literary aspirations and has started down that path. What do you think?
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to the second volume of Obama's memoirs, which I'm not quite sure when they're coming out. And he is Obama's clearly the best literary stylist of any American president, except Jefferson, arguably. And Lincoln was an amazing writer, but Obama he's a first-rate writer of nonfiction and storyteller, and he has literary ambitions and he often fulfills them. Although one can find things to criticize about his books as well. Carter has made his living as a writer, which is what I actually most appreciate about his writing. His books, the one on his early childhood called An Hour Before Daylight is the best in literary terms. But he's, as you say, he's a risk taker, and he wrote a book of poetry, and I use some of the poems in my book because they tell us things about his life. And he wrote a novel, not great, and a lot of other books. But what I most respect about him as an author is that instead of taking $1 million to give a speech to I don't know, some trade industry group, which all the rest of them do, or going on corporate boards, picking up an easy check for that. He hasn't done any of that. When he does take money, it's for the Carter Center, and he supports himself and Rosalind, who also writes sometimes, with close to a book a year, every 18 months for 40 years. And so you have to respect that.
I absolutely do. I think I'm 3 for 12 years. So,
Yeah.
Thanks
well,
for answering that one,
yeah,
Jonathan. And
What?
thank you for answering that one.
Oh,
And
sure.
thank you and Megan both for so much for attending today. We have to pull the plug, I'm afraid. But
Yes.
thanks to
Well,
all our listeners and viewers. A special thanks to our sponsors. And as we leave, there'll be a flash screen that will come up. We'll give you a direct link to ordering Jonathan's book, as well as a link to donate to the festival, which we'd certainly appreciate as we look forward to our 21st gathering next year, which we can all hope will be up close and in person. But again, thank you both so much for today. It was great.
thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys having me. And good luck on your book, Megan.
thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Okay, see you guys.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye bye.